thinking about, well, why is that? Why, if adolescents are, unlikely to have chronic illness and disease at sort of their healthiest capacity, what's kind of happening here? What explains this?
Start with drive.
Yeah, so the largest impact on adolescents around their health and safety are accidental injuries. And most of those are automobile, not all of them, but actually the brain work has direct links to driving, and I'll talk about that. So yeah, that's a really good point. Any other ideas about, what some of these unique risks are to adolescents?
Experimenting with drugs and alcohol.
Yeah, so beginning to start to experiment with things like drugs and alcohol, and I'll talk about that today. I mean, we sort of think about, especially marijuana and alcohol, as kind of a normative developmental experience because most adolescents will at least engage in those activities once, but they do have some really important and lasting impacts when we consider brain development. So we'll talk about that as well. You do see mental health concerns arise in adolescents, and the top three explanations of adolescent death are accidental injuries, suicide, which is, it's relatively low percentage, and then homicide. And actually suicide and homicide often switch places. Sometimes homicide's number 2, and sometimes suicide's number 2. But accidental injuries are certainly one place. And so one thing we think about, the practical implications are, what kind of safety nets can we consider for this age group? Because, and honestly, I have to tell Karen we should probably change the title of my talk because I don't talk a lot about substance use, but I will show you that, as we know, experimentation with, this is alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana. Most of the time of use happens in adolescence and early adulthood, so the ages of really 15 to early 20s, you see this spike in adolescents who engage in these substances earlier are more likely to form addictive and problematic substance use. But one thing I want you to think about is when I describe what's really happening in the brain, and adolescents are also using substances, drugs, the way that drugs work is they work on our brains and they change the way we think and feel. And just thinking about that being an even greater risk when we know what's happening to the adolescent brain, which we'll talk about. So we look at this, I love this. So you got suspended from school because you filled your teacher's desk drawers with horse manure and then you nailed them shut. What were you thinking? And the kid says, I'm 15. I'm usually not thinking. But that's actually not true. So adolescents are thinking through everything they do. They actually go through the exact same process we do to make a decision. So this kid has a choice. He can put the manure in the teacher's drawer, nail it shut, or he won't do that. And he can actually come up with all the consequences that we can come up with. So what are some consequences for this kid?
Suspended.
Okay, so he gets suspended, he could get grounded, he could miss some activity at school because of his behavior.
Privileges taken away.
Yeah, privileges taken away. Are there positive consequences?
He's the cool kid.
He's the cool kid. People laugh, he gets attention, he gets to get back at his teacher. And so, adolescents are very well aware of all those things. I think about a decision, I'm sure that none of you made these decisions, but like whether I would sneak out after curfew or something, come home, am I gonna go back out? My parents are asleep. I could come up with all the consequences. But the thing that adolescents, one thing that's unique is that their peer group is much more critical in the consequences, in the looking at the consequences than they are for adults. So for this adolescent, they're going to be much more influenced by being the coolest in the class than influenced by being suspended from school or loss of privileges. And some of that is directly tied to what's happening in the brain. And so we'll look at that. And also just to set the stage before I talk about the adolescent brain is, some of us were more riskier than others. Some of us probably got in more trouble than others. And what are some of those factors that determine that? If you think about your own early adolescent, what are some of the things that influence whether they're gonna sort of make the riskier choices or not? Okay, so what's and I can think about this sort of generally as like, well, what are the supervision components? What are the rules that are set? What are gonna be the consequences for them? And so definitely parenting does matter. You know, the idea of how much are parents aware of where their child is? How much do parents set rules and follow through with them? Definitely an important factor.
Friends who they're,
Yeah, so.
peers who they hang around with.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I guess a big kind of outcome of this, which is not going to be surprising to any of you, is that when adolescents are at this place of maybe engaging in riskier behaviors, the more they're with a positive peer group, the better, because they will be positively peer pressured, because all adolescents have peer pressure. So it could be their peer pressure to join a sports team or to join a service activity or to study together, or it could be that they're peer pressured to you know, sneak out of school or, you know, engage in this riskier thing. Yeah, so peers are heavily important. What other kind of factors? Might determine the kind of decisions.
Self-esteem.
Yeah, so more of kind of these individual factors. And so self-esteem is one important one. Adolescents who have confidence and self-esteem, they're more empowered to make a choice that may differ from the group. There's also temperamental differences. So, you know, I think about my two kids, and you guys probably have this experience as well. My older son is very cautious. He walked later in life. He doesn't really like to take physical risk, where my younger son is much more just ready to jump in. He's more impulsive. He's more risk-oriented. And risk doesn't always mean something bad also, which I'll say. So you might have a child that is just, ever since birth, has been a kid that wants to push the limits. Or you may have a kid that ever since birth is a kid that kind of wants to be more cautious and hang back. Peer influence, supervision, kids have different attitudes towards risk, whether they're excited by it or fearful of it. How much is the adolescent thinking about what's ahead in the future? And then this critical thing that's happening is the brain development. That explains a lot of this. So what I want to do is talk about sort of the tale of two systems of the brain. We're going to talk first about the prefrontal cortex, which a lot of you have probably read things about because it's gotten a lot of attention. And then we're also going to talk about the second brain system, which is more the emotional piece of the brain. And it's pretty striking information. I can say when I used to teach the brain and cognitive development early on, I thought it was the most boring part of adolescence. And now I'm very, very, I think it's one of the most critical things to know. And that's one reason I come and do these kinds of things. It hasn't been that, you know, we haven't had that much time in history where we've been able to really look at the brain. Before, you had to wait till someone died. I mean, it wasn't until the mid-1980s that MRIs were even available for this kind of research to happen. And now, you know, lots of scientists have these scanning machines and a functional MRI where you can actually look at what's happening to the brain while it's engaging in a task. This work is pretty new. And one of the people that's been really important, this doctor, his name is Dr. Deed, he wanted to understand the brain of children with autism. And then what he realized is, like, we have no idea what happens to the normal, typical brain over time. So we're not even close to being able to understand a brain that's more atypical. So he started bringing in children, flying them in from all across the country and scanning their brains across time. It's from childhood into adulthood. And that's where a lot of this work has come from. And before this work, the view was that brain development happened, the most critical period of brain development happens earliest in life. So you might be familiar with like a lot of the work on like birth to 3 and the idea of how important those critical years are. And definitely prenatal development, infancy is really important for for brain development. But the assumption was that all that early stuff was like this huge increase in brain activity, and then it kind of leveled off very quickly. And so your brain is actually its full adults, or 90% of its full adult size by age 8 or 9. And so, you know, a lot of scientists kind of thought, well, most of what happens to the brain happens early. and then it's pretty stable after that. But what these scans have allowed researchers to see is that there's this second critical period where as major changes you see in infancy happen in adolescence. And that was kind of shocking to scientists. So we'll talk about this prefrontal cortex piece again, and that would be the first tail. And when I show you images, and this is one reason I gave you handouts, just if you wanted to take them home with you, there's two things that are happening to this part of the brain, and I'll tell you why that's important. But the first thing is that they are decreasing in gray matter with pruning, which I'll tell you what that looks like and what it means. And they're also increasing in white matter. And again, I'll show you images and talk to you about what that means. So the prefrontal cortex is thought to be sort of the seed of civilization, what makes us civilized human beings, that allows us to control our impulses, that allows us to make reasoned, rational decisions. This is also the last part of our brain to develop. So the part of our brain that makes us civilized, that keeps us in a society where, you know, we can control ourselves, is the last part of the brain to develop. And I'll show you what that looks like. But best guess on the research now is that this part of the brain isn't fully developed. Does anybody know what the magic age is? 25. Yep, which is, it's really funny. That's when you can rent a car, and that's the only, they knew what they were doing. Like basically, you know, the only place that gets it right are the insurance companies. But it's true. So they estimate that this part of the brain is fully developed and functional by age 25. And how do we know this? Well, these are neurons. Neurons are the special cells in our body that communicate information and help us learn. Does anybody know when we have all the neurons we'll ever have? When we're born, which is really interesting and has a lot to do also with the substance use and adolescence piece of this. When you're born, you have all the neurons you'll ever have. You don't regrow them. You don't spontaneously develop more. You have all of them you'll have at birth. And what do neurons do for us? And why do we care how many we have? Well, the dendrites, and then the axon and the axon terminals, this is how information is shared throughout our brain and body. And so messages come in from one neuron, they spread across the neuron, and they go out and give information to other neurons. So if you think about, you know, touching a really hot stove and your hands lifting up, it's that communication that's happening through neurons. And what else is going to say about these before I move to the next slide to show you? So we have all of this capacity when we're born. And when you look at this image, just pretend this is like a little segment of one person's brain at 1 month of age, 3 months of age, 6 months of age, and 15 months of age. So what's happening here? They have, all the neurons are here at 1 month of age, but what's happening? Yeah, so being able to communicate better. Why? Yeah, so what happens with development is that neurons grow, and they grow and their connections grow, the dendrites spread out, the axons spread out, and there's more connections, which means learning. So you can think about this 1 month old as they're able to hold their head up, as people are talking to them, as they're able to see and hear new things. That's what experience is what makes our neurons expand and grow. Scientists kind of knew this. What scientists didn't know was, what surprised scientists was this. So this is a same individual at age 14, at birth, 6 years old, 14 years old. So what's happening to neurons?
They're shrinking.
They're shrinking, or some are being lost. Is this good or bad? and it coincides with puberty.
Is this without drugs?
This is,
Oh.
yeah.
It's like, is this the normal?
Think of this as our
normal?
typically
Okay.
developing adolescent. Yeah, so we've got, so up to 6 years old, you have this just complete focus on growth and expansion. Then you hit puberty and you've got this focus on sort of pruning some of this away. This is actually good, right? Because I think about this as like the messy office kind of thing. You know, you can have an office with tons and tons of stuff everywhere, like this. And then you realize, well, I never look at that book, I never touch this pile of paper, I never do this. And if you clean that out, then it's should be more efficient. And that's what's happening at puberty, is all this expansion, growth, and development has happened, and then around puberty, the brain starts to say, okay, I'm gonna clean out the unused stuff, and I'm just gonna keep the connections and neurons that have value, that I'm using. And this is good. This makes them more efficient. Is there any way this could be bad?
The experiences you had with that.
Yeah, experience is critical. So I'll give you one really extreme example. There are some people that scientists have followed who have been raised in isolation in their lives, and you've probably seen some of those. There's a movie on this woman, for example, her name is Jeannie, and she was in Los Angeles. They found her when she was an adolescent, and she had been living in one room with no human contact. And when they found Jeannie, she couldn't talk. And they did a lot of work to try to get her to talk. She was 16 or 17 at the time. And she was able to learn a few words, but she was never able to learn to communicate. And so the thought is that because those neural capacities never developed, that they were pruned away. And you don't regrow them. So they have found that brains of children who have undergone abuse and neglect are actually significantly smaller in size and in gray matter. And so some kids never get to even develop this. And then if you don't get to use this capacity, then it gets pruned away, which that's a very extreme example. But if you have an adolescent who isn't engaged, isn't doing things that are creating growth and development, they could potentially lose capacity that's important. This is why it's much harder for us as adults to learn a language or an instrument. We can do it if we keep trying, but it's very difficult. The other thing I'll say about this is if an adolescent is using substances, when this very typical pruning is happening, there might also be loss of neural capacities due to substance use. I don't want to scare you, because I'll just say I engaged in normative adolescent behaviors, and my brain capacity is fine. What it could have been without, I don't know, but it's not like experimentation, a slight amount of experimentation is going to wreck the brain. It's not that. It's that prolonged exposure to substances at this critical age of brain development has an even greater impact than if they were doing it when they were older. So that's really an important piece of this. And that's why we're really worried about this small group of adolescents who are engaging in substances very young, 6th grade, 7th grade, because that can have really critical long-term effects. Do you have any questions about this piece just before I move on, or any thoughts that? So this is the gray matter piece. You're seeing a decrease in gray matter because the unused neural capacities are shrinking. And this just shows that as well, that those capacities that aren't used and reinforced, well, the ones that are used and reinforced are strengthened. The ones that aren't will die out. And then what also happens is this increase in white matter. And again, I'm focusing on this part of the brain. We communicate through electrical impulses. That's how messages get sent. And so they jump through neurons as an electrical impulse. And white matter is this stuff right here, the myelin sheath, which you can think of as insulation. So the more insulation that you have, the more efficient a system should work. And so that's also what's happening for adolescents, is that they're gaining insulation in the neural pathways they're keeping, which again means that this part should be more efficient. Sorry, my phone is vibrating over there. Can be more efficient, more effective, they're better thinkers. So what does that mean? This is an MRI image of a typically developing adolescent, both from childhood through early adulthood. The colors on MRI indicate heat, activity, and use. And so as you look at this, this is the prefrontal cortex. Light color, light blue means little activation, little activity, and the darkening and purpling means fully developed. So you can see this person at age 5, age 8, age 12, age 16, and age 20. And this is the same image just from above. At age 5, 8, 12, 16, and 20. So a few things. I remember that my 9-year-old shouldn't be able to plan ahead and remember things. Like, I have to remember that. Like, he doesn't have the brain capacity to do so. So when I was fussing at him Tuesday for the fact that he totally forgot to put his homework folder in his backpack, and he's not really supposed to be able to do that. Doesn't mean we can't fuss at him or try to encourage it, but what else do you see, especially around the ages of 12, 16, 20? What do you think about this? A lot is happening. I mean, a 12-year-old has almost the same capacity at this level as an 8-year-old. And then with puberty, you see a significant change happening. And that's good, right? In some ways. But it makes us understand a little bit what's happening.